Good morning, everyone. Pastor Dan here with the next in our series of lectures on the history of Israel and the main characters who make up that history. In our last lecture on the Bible and ancient Israel, we completed our brief study of this story, starting with Abraham and the patriarchs in the book of Genesis, and ending with the wandering in the desert, the forging of the Mosaic covenant at Mount Sinai, and a brief discussion of the basis of that covenant in the law of Moses. As was already mentioned, the book of Deuteronomy consists of a series of sermons by Moses to the people as they were about to enter the promised land. The theme of these sermons is covenant faithfulness. Moses exhorts the people to remain steadfast in their obedience to God's law. A word about this in relation to God's mercy and grace, however, might be in order. The reason I say this is because many people are of the opinion that the Hebrew Bible is all about law and God's wrath when people are disobedient, while the New Testament is all about God's grace and mercy and love as preached by Jesus. In fact, in the early church, there was a man who believed that the Jewish God was a different God from the God of Jesus. And he proposed a Bible that consisted of the letters of Paul, an edited version of the book of Luke, and eliminating the Old Testament entirely. That, of course, was rejected, fortunately, because the fact of the matter is that both the Old and the New Testament contain law and grace. Both are in each one. God's grace and mercy are a big story of the Old Testament. For example, it was an act of grace whereby God chose Abraham and gave him a threefold promise of many ancestors, land, and that he would be a blessing to all the peoples of the earth. It was by grace that the patriarchs, despite their many flaws, prevailed and thrived in the land. It was by grace that Jacob's sons multiplied and became 12 tribes in the land of Egypt. It was by grace that God freed the slaves and provided for their needs throughout their journey through the wilderness. And it was by grace that they now stood ready to enter and conquer the promised land through the leadership of Joshua. Both the Old and the New Testament consist of law and grace. God is just, and he expects the people to live by both the moral and other laws he has given them to serve as the foundation of their covenant relationship. But God is also merciful and generous with them over and over and over again. God's jealousy toward God's people is not a possessive jealousy. It is based on God's desire that the people thrive and create a community that reflects God's steadfast love for all the people. God's mercy and justice are woven together in such a way that the people will learn to trust God, have faith in God's promise, and obey God in all things. In his sermon to them, Moses therefore exhorts the people to remain faithful to God's law. This being the basis of their covenant relationship with God, it is their responsibility to trust and obey, as the old hymn puts it. So long as they do that, Moses emphasizes, They will thrive in this land, flowing with milk and honey, which, by the way, is a reference to the fact that there are many goats and date palms in the land. However, if they decide to abandon the covenant God made with them and decide to worship the gods of their pagan neighbors, God will give them up to their enemies, and they will lose their land, their produce, and their independence. The Promised Land is located in a very strategic area for the empires to the north and Egypt to the south. Moreover, before they can even take possession of the land, they are going to have to defeat its current occupants, the Canaanites, who exist in a number of city-states. They don't have a unified government, one king over all of them. It is rather a number of independent city-states. On top of that, from the west, the Philistines also have designs on this land, and they have created a number of communities on the coast after invading from the sea, communities that exist to this day on what is known as the Gaza Strip. To put it mildly, the enemies of the Israelites are many, and their resources are few. However, as Moses tells them, this land was promised to them through their ancestors, the patriarchs, and God will give them the victory so long as they firmly continue to trust God and do as their leader Joshua tells them to do. Now, where did Joshua come from? Joshua first caught the eye of Moses when the people got into a fight with a group called the Amalekites in the Sinai Desert. Thereafter, Moses decided that Joshua would be his successor. So after Moses dies on Mount Nebo, remember God tells Moses, because of an act of disobedience, that he's not allowed into the Promised Land. But God does him the favor of telling him to climb Mount Nebo, which is now in modern-day Jordan. And from the top of Mount Nebo, you can see the entire expanse of the Promised Land. So up he goes, he sees the Promised Land, but he never enters it. And there he dies. So, at this point, Joshua takes over as the military leader, and it's going to be his job to lead the people into the Promised Land and conquer it from all those Canaanite city-states. Now, Joshua enters what divides the Promised Land from the land to the east is the Jordan River Valley. The Jordan River at this time was far wider, and the water flowed rapidly. It was much more difficult to cross at this time than it is today because of the use of the Jordan for things like irrigation and other matters pertaining to water. It looks pretty peaked at this point, but at that time it flowed rapidly, and it would not have been possible for this group to just walk across. So God makes it possible for them first to cross the river, but then their first challenge is that right across the Jordan River is the city of Jericho, which is fortified with thick 8-foot walls to protect the city. And there is no way that the Israelites could have conquered the city of Jericho with those walls there in the usual way. So Joshua had the people march around the walls, while following the Ark of the Covenant. Remember, the Ark of the Covenant was a gold box. There were two cherubim at the top. Inside were the tables of the law that Moses had received from God. The Ark of the Covenant was Israel's primary symbol of God's presence with them at this point. Of course, there's no temple yet. So, around Jericho they march 7 times, following the priests who are carrying the Ark of the Covenant. And then they are instructed to stop. The priests blow the shofars, the horns, and it makes a terrible blast. And then all the Israelites scream at the top of their lungs, and what happens? The walls come a-tumbling down. The Israelites rushed in and burned Jericho to the ground. Now, way back in the 1950s, British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon decided she wanted to find the walls of Jericho. So she travels to Jericho and she does an archaeological dig at the Tell there. And she does find some massive 6-foot walls. The problem is that when they were dated, they dated all the way back to somewhere between 8,000 and 6,000 BC, way before the Israelites were there. And this would have been the 13th century BC. So you see, it could not have been those walls. However, the fortunate thing about this is that they seem to have discovered what looks to be the oldest settlement in human history, right there in Jericho. So, while there was evidence that the walls were rebuilt from time to time, never were they rebuilt in the same way, not in any way that could possibly have deterred an army. So the story is legendary, but we're going to talk more about the relationship between history and the story as we have it in the Bible later on. We'll get to that. In the biblical narrative, the next part of Joshua's campaign is that he focuses on the hill country. Remember, the hill country is in the center of the Promised Land. You've got the coastal plain along the Mediterranean. You've got the Jordan River Valley on the east, and in the middle you've got the hill country. Not particularly high. For example, Jerusalem is up in the hill country, 2,000 feet up. But when you travel from Jericho, which is 1,400 feet below sea level, that gets you up to 1,300 and 1,400 feet, which is quite a climb, becomes a famous road, and appears again in the New Testament in one of Jesus' famous parables. But in any case, from there, Joshua captures the city of Ai, which means ruins. And now the other kings in the Canaanite kingdoms in the area become alarmed. So in response, the king of Jerusalem rallies the principal cities in the area. But Joshua routs the enemies after God comes to Joshua's aid by pelting the opposition with stones from heaven. They didn't stand much of a chance with God on Joshua's side. Next, after conquering the hill country, he turns to the foothills. These are called the Shephelah. They are to the west of the hill country as you are descending down to the coastal plain along the Mediterranean Sea, and he conquers the main cities there. Then, from there, he turns north, and he attacks, again, another alliance, which was organized under King Jabin of Hazor. This includes the area of Galilee all the way to the mount, to the base of the Mount of Hermon. Joshua prevails again. He burns Hazor to the ground. And so now Joshua is in possession of the Jordan River Valley, the hill country, the Shephelah, all the way north to Galilee. What he does not have is the area along the coast where the Philistines continue to hold on. And that bodes not so well for the future, because the Israelites and the Philistines will fight it out again and again, and all the way until King David, who finally defeats them and conquers the entire expanse of the Promised Land and then some, which is why David is considered the greatest of Israel's kings, or one of the reasons. Obviously, his piety toward God, his having written the Psalms, all of these things factor into David's reputation as the greatest of the kings of Israel. And there is a monument, well, I don't know if you'd call it a monument. They claim it's the burial place of David in the old city of Jerusalem to this day, where Jews go to pay their respects to King David, although this is not the place where he was really buried. It's just a place to recognize King David. Okay, so at the end of this campaign, all right, Joshua is now 110 years old. So he gathers all the Israelite tribes, all 12 of them together, and he exhorts them to honor and follow God and God's law. And he tells them, as Moses said in the book of Deuteronomy, if you follow God, you will prosper. If you don't, God will give you up to your enemies. This is a common theme again and again, one that we are going to run into in a big way when we get to the book of Judges. But in any case, this particular address to the people contains that famous verse of Joshua where he says, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. All the people pledge that they are going to serve the Lord. And so Joshua dies, and he's buried near the city of Shechem. Now, last time I pointed out that archaeologists have not been able to confirm the battles recorded in the book of Joshua. They have dug where the cities existed at the time of Joshua, and here's what they found. 2 of the towns mentioned were in fact burned to the ground. But in fact, this took place 100 years apart from each other, so it could not have taken place at the same time. It is possible that the story was compressed time-wise, and that the Israelites were responsible for these events, but there is no way of knowing for sure. One thing we can make sense of: in the mid-13th century, when Egypt's power was waning, it seems that, as I mentioned in a previous lecture, that Semitic tribes formerly living in Egypt returned to Canaan. This, of course, fits in with the information we do have, the Merneptah Stele and the discovery of Israelite villages in the late 13th century in the hill country. Moreover, the hill country at this time was largely unoccupied, and so it would have been a likely time for the tribes of Israel to settle in this region. There is clear evidence of Israelite villages, like I say, in the hill country in the 13th century. So probably what is known as the period of conquering the land was more like an infiltration, where these Semitic tribes traveled north from Egypt and gradually infiltrated the region. Probably there were battles between them and others who were nearby or in the area. But it was less an organized military campaign and more a kind of gradual infiltration. Now, before we get into the book of Judges, it is important to point out that the history of Israel, from Deuteronomy through 2 Kings, is often referred to as the Deuteronomistic history. The reason for this is that the story is told from the point of view of what Moses tells the people in Deuteronomy. Namely, if they obey God and remain faithful to the covenant, God will prosper and protect them against their enemies, of which there were many: the Edomites, the Ammonites, the Philistines, the Canaanites, just to name a few. However, if they betrayed the covenant and followed after the gods of their neighbors, God would give them up to their enemies and they would be defeated. It might be helpful to know that these books, in their current form, were not entirely composed until probably the 6th century. They may have been started during the reign of King Josiah in the 7th century. You might remember that parts of the book of Deuteronomy were discovered in the temple when Josiah had the temple cleaned out, and King Josiah instituted at that point in time major religious reforms in the kingdom of Judah. The kingdom of Israel to the north had already been defeated, and the Israelites to the north had already been exiled. In any case, King Josiah had the pagan shrines torn down. He eliminated pagan religious practices, such as male prostitution on the Temple Mount, and he reinstated the laws and festivals as laid out in the book of Deuteronomy. It was said that this was the first time that the people celebrated the Passover properly since their escape from Egypt. Amazing. Also, shortly after the death of Josiah in a war with Egypt, the Babylonians capture Jerusalem and exile all but the poorest of the poor from the land. This began the 50-year exile in Babylon. Clearly, in order to maintain their identity as God's people, they needed to compile their history and their laws. During the exile, therefore, the documents were compiled into the history as we have it now. The people would not return to Judah. Of course, Samaria at this point was occupied by a mixed race of Israelites who were left when the Assyrians captured the northern kingdom. They left, those who weren't a threat, and they resettled people of other ethnic backgrounds. These groups mixed and formed what became the Samaritans. That was occupied, Samaria. And Galilee was largely occupied by Gentiles at the time. So the people who were exiled to Babylon would not return to Judah until 50 years later, when King Cyrus of Persia basically made mincemeat of the Babylonians and issued a decree that all religious minorities could return to their homeland. Some of the Judeans did, some didn't. Some stayed in Babylon. I mean, we're talking about another generation of people who didn't know anything about the Promised Land, whose only home had ever been Babylon, and they had no interest in returning. They had a life there. So some returned, some didn't. I would refer you to the book of Isaiah, particularly chapter 40, where this begins. This is 2nd Isaiah. There were 3 of them. Isaiah had a school of prophets, and there were successors to the original Isaiah of Jerusalem. 2nd Isaiah there talks about the Lord making straight a path through the desert. The hills will be made low, the valleys will be lifted up, etc., etc. Isaiah is talking about the Jews returning back to Judea. He is telling them that even though the journey is a